Hi, my name is Alec Green, and I'm a descendant of John Marshall, a direct descendant. I'm a great-great-grandson, and that's on my mother's side. And on my father's side, I'm related to my grandfather, great-grandfather, who was A. Alexander G. Green, who came from Culpeper County and moved up on top of the mountain, up above where we lived, and lived there for a period of time, and then moved down into the valley, which was in the Markham area, and he started a mill, and had a mill down there. And one time, he had boxcars come off on the side from the railroad, and one time he got on one of the cars and went down through Markham and waving and telling his wife goodbye. And with the car, it's a downhill grade, and after it got to a certain point, it stopped. And he was all right, but then he had a son, several sons, but James R. Green was the one that stayed in the Markham area, and he acquired more land, and he had 4 children, and he gave each one of his each child a farm, and one of the farms that he gave was the Gibson land, and that was in the Crooked Run area. And the knowledge that I acquired from that area at all, I acquired through visiting the Gibsons. We would go down there every Sunday and after dinner and eat and visit. And my grandmother was a Strother, and the Strothers had lived in the Markham area a long time too, and they were the family that Eddie Strother and Thomas Strother and Kate Berry and several others all came from. And of course Eddie and Kate both lived in that Run area. My grandfather was James R. Green, and he had five individual farms. And then he had these children, and he gave the land to the children. And then my father, after he had his land, he added to that. And at one time, my father had approximately 2,000 acres of land. And then my father, he didn't believe in selling anything, and so he gave the land to, he had 3 children. I have 2 brothers, and he gave the land, each of us a farm. And then later on, each of us purchased some more land, but and then I sold my farm. I gave it away, and but at one time there was about 2,000 acres of land.
Well,
Oh yeah, most farms at that time were about 300 to 400 acres of land. That consisted of farm, and a few farms were larger, and a whole lot of them were smaller.
well, to describe how the labor situation, how many men?
Well, all people at that time had employees, which were usually black, and they had tenant houses, and these laborers had families, and they lived in those tenant houses. And they got very little money, but they did get what we call allowances, and the allowances consisted, in most cases, of you had 2 hogs that they kept, and then you gave them about 350 pounds of meat besides that, of hog meat. And then you had flour, in which you took your wheat to the mills, had that ground, you came back and brought that to them. And they had a meal, and then you kept the chickens, and then we at that time we had contracts with the wives of the employees that they raised turkeys,
Oh.
and the landowner furnished the money for the turkeys and the feed, and then when we sold them, we split the profits, split whatever money was left, and it was usually very little. The people that how well I knew the people in Delaplane, or how well I knew the people in Linden. I myself lived in Markham all my life, but at that time it was, which it still is, 6 miles apart, and it was just like being in a different state almost. You had relatives that lived in each one, but you didn't know the ins and out of it, and you had nothing to do with the churches, or in fact, in going to the churches, you had your own church, and you had your own school, and you lived just like which you don't do now. The distance was so far apart, you didn't go. You had acquaintances in each place, and of course, if you was close enough person for you to make that much effort to ride that far, you could do it, but most of us stayed in, if I would stay in Markham, and people would stay in Delaplane, and so the intimate things that occurred in Delaplane, I only heard about them and secondhand, and they have been embellished by the time they got to me, and so it became better stories. Markham had 3 stores, and those stores would sell everything from fertilizers, fencing, all groceries, to clothes, shoes. We sold everything. And one of the amusing things was after I was in the store myself, and when I was in there, they'd have traveling salesmen, and they had these people selling us shoes, and my uncles had all been out in St. Louis, and they'd gotten to be very prominent people out there. And one of them was the vice president of Peter Shoe Company, but anyway, we were selling their shoes, and one of the salesmen asked the other salesman, says, why do you go to that little place in Markham? He says, you don't sell any shoes there. And he says, I go there because he's got 3 uncles in the Peter Shoe Company. And we'd buy, I can well remember taking times buying 1 pair of shoes for myself and 12 pair for the store. Really, we knew each other intimately, in the fact that when we knew everything about, we all did very little, but the little bit we did do, everybody else knew it. And of course, we went to each other's house every Saturday night, and we would all collect, and all the young people would collect in somebody's house, and we'd have a party there, and we'd drink some whiskey and discuss religion. All authorities on religion after we'd had several drinks. Markham was an area that had more blacks than any other of those areas, I would think. Almost, well, the person that owned the land was always white in most cases, but everybody else was black. And I ran that store, and I had a policeman come in there one day, and he says, you know how many people are sitting on your porch out there? And he says, 40. He says, they're all black. But that was a gathering place for people, and we kept the store open until 10, 11 o'clock at night. And the mail did all the shopping as far as the grocery goes. The man would come in, and he couldn't come until after clothes after he'd gotten off the farm, and he'd come in and buy everything, and we seldom saw the women.
Really? What was it? Do you have a lot of credit accounts?
Oh, well, all credit. we called our store the Markham cash store, and never saw any cash at all.
Well, how would things like that happen? Would you get to know who was a good creditor and who wasn't, and would you sell them on, or were there a lot of negotiations, or what would you do?
Oh, you wouldn't go into that at all. The way that worked out was the person came, they bought $10 worth of stuff, and they counted the money out, and they had $8, and said, well, I'll give you that next time. And so then next time he came, and then he'd probably pay that one, and about 2 or 3 times later, it gradually worked up until you got to the point where, well, yeah, I'm not going to give you any more credit. And then he'd start again paying for cash, and then a little while he'd owe you a little bit more, and so each person had about 5 or 6 bad accounts, which you were current, which of course you never collected, but you're making enough money off the other, supposedly to carry you. And it was a very good job.
Well, that